A reading from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 12. I'm just going to read the first two verses. Would you listen and see if the Spirit brings a live and fresh word to you today? Therefore, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies or comforts of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual work or worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Present yourselves as a living sacrifice. It's amazing this Christianity thing hasn't caught on more than it has with words like that. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. I'm trying to picture, Romans 12:1 on a big sign at the end zone of a football game. Not very good marketing. I think John 3:16, God so loved the world, was a better move. But living sacrifice. In a culture that rejects sacrificial religion, it rejects both it realistically, meaning an actual sacrifice, and metaphorically. The world will reject sacrificial religion. In a world like that, what on earth can we make of it? Especially when we're in a time where, as Craig says, 2020 wants to do it all to us. What might it mean to present ourselves as a living sacrifice? I think the question needs to be answered at a couple of levels today. The first thing to pay attention to, though, is that very first word of the sentence, therefore. I took a seminar on Romans when I was in seminary, and we translated the whole book, and we went through it piece by piece by piece. We really dug in. And we got to that therefore, and in the discussion, it dawned on all of us. It was therefore because of the last 11 chapters. This was not a therefore that was, just some little thing. This had to do with all of God's work in those 11 chapters. Therefore, all right? Because there is sin in the world, therefore, because the world is fighting against God's project to bring all things together in perfect harmony, fighting against God's creative work in the world, therefore. Because we have faith, and that faith leads us to live faithfully in God's presence, that's what gives us our hope for a future, not our identity as being part of any one particular group. Therefore. And as we live that faithful life, that life of faith, we are drawn into the work of Christ, and that work moves from chaos to beauty, from death to new life. It moves that way within us. And as through faithfulness we are drawn into the presence and the work of Christ, we die a death like his, which means that the I in the center of our life that seeks to grasp hold of everything that will give us satisfaction and security and pleasure. When we move that away and instead that person dies and a new one emerges that is connected to and united with the presence of God. Because that kind of a faithful life leads us into a new future. It also leads us to a place where nothing can separate us from the love of God. Therefore, because God's promises are solid and faithful, therefore, present yourselves as a living sacrifice, so that ultimately you may know the will of God, so that you will know what's good, acceptable, and perfect. At some level, it still hasn't answered the question. What's a living sacrifice? So we'd ask about the two ways that sacrifice was used within the Jewish religion. The first way it's used is as a method of making things pure. So we have sullied our lives by sinning, by rejecting God's presence. And so we give a sacrifice so that things might become pure. A living sacrifice, well, that's continuing the work of being united with Christ so that we can remove that selfish, self-centered part of our life that gives us no satisfaction, but that we hope will. And instead open our hearts and our being and our drive to be a part of God's work in the world. That's what it means to be a living sacrifice, but it means more than that. Because the other offerings, the grain offerings that came, that's really bringing food for the party. That's what the sacrificial system was about at that point. It was an explosion of festival and celebration, and the sacrifices were brought so that people could enjoy the time together. So if we're going to be a living sacrifice, we dedicate our lives to drawing people together, to celebrating the wonder of God's creation as it unfolds within us and unfolds within history. Present yourselves as a living sacrifice. Now, I suppose that I could then use this sermon to offer you a harangue, to say, well, you need to do this. You know, you haven't done the living sacrifice thing well enough. You got to find ways to purify yourselves. You got to find ways to draw people together and serve the world around you, but not today. Not after this week. You all are doing remarkably well. I wonder if you know that. On Wednesday, I'm not even sure who it was, but I heard that one of the members of our church was evacuated, and they went to the Salvation Army. And so I just asked a innocuous question: is there a shelter at the Salvation Army? No, they went to volunteer to fill food bags because that's what they do on Wednesdays. Evacuated, open heart, and they wanted to serve other people. Same thing happened with the Milk Duds this weekend. And then on Saturday, I got an email from one of you who'd been reaching out to other members of the congregation, and it just occurred to them, well, shouldn't we check in on our pastor? Is there anything we can do for you, Pastor? I would say that you're presenting yourselves as living sacrifices in those stories. This is a congregation with an open heart, a congregation that recognizes that when you serve God, it means you serve other people. You seek the best for other people. And so I'm not bound to harangue you under these circumstances, especially during a time when we're carrying an awful lot of anxiety. But I think it's possible we may have to run deeper into this phrase, into these verses, so that they begin to touch us at that level of life and death. Because these are anxious times all over the world. Things have gotten far enough out of balance pretty much everywhere that people are turning to anyone who will promise them some security and some new life hope. They're turning to dictators and charlatans. They're fighting with one another, taking on identities that split them apart instead of drawing them together. These are anxious times. We talk about COVID all the time. Why? We're afraid of the issues of life and death. We're afraid to die. I don't know about you, but it's something that does come upon me. Fires start to come and you have anxiety about your own life, the life of the people that are closest to you. It's terrifying. It's causing all kinds of mental illness problems in our nation because it just grabs hold of our hearts and won't let go, the fear. And I can't tell you that it's going to be all right because God loves us. If I did tell you that, you really shouldn't believe me because things do happen that are destructive. Lives are sometimes lost. Hope is sometimes abolished for a time. So I can't tell you that everything's going to be all right for good and faithful people. But there are some things I can tell you because the Apostle Paul has said them. We know right now that God is on the move. God's on the move, and we can tell that because all the pieces are in place. As chaos begins to overwhelm, that's the place where God starts to do God's work. That's a moment when things can tip and new things can happen. And we start to see just little bits of it. The very fact that it seems like the whole world is aware that injustice is permeating our cultures. The very awareness suggests to me that there is hope peeking through in the midst of the struggle and the anxiety and the anger and the frustration. It's in things like the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a little piece of the injustice of the world, and yet people seem to be moved at this moment to see some new thing happen. And so we can feel that God is on the move. It's the way God works. Death like his to a resurrection like his. From chaos to beauty and hope. If we can hang on to that, if we can touch that energy in our lives, well, then we'll have a sense of security and hope. Because the other thing I can tell you is that God's promises are real, solid, and true. We can count on them. As we begin to offer ourselves as living sacrifice, that is to say, as we start to change the motivations of our life, from serving our own needs to serving the needs of God's creative project, well, things start to shift. Then we cannot be separated from the love of God. It's interesting, this change of motivation that lets go of the I in the center of us, this change of motivation is one of the goals of nearly every serious religious tradition. It's one of the 7 goals that they have. I'll tell you about the others another time. But a change in motivation from focusing on ourselves, making sure we're okay first and then taking care of others, to a focus on opening our hearts and our lives to the purposes of God. When we do that, we know what God's will is. We can tell what is good, acceptable, and perfect or complete. And we can know that nothing will separate us from the love of God, including death. Can we sit with that and accept that? That knowing the love of God, we can be sure that we are cared for in life and in death? It's a tall order. I'm reminded of a little piece that Annie Lamott wrote a number of years ago about forgiveness. She said that, Christians are all about forgiveness. She says, I'm not really that kind of Christian, but I thought I ought to try to forgive people. And it occurred to me that you shouldn't start with Hitler if you want to learn how to forgive. Fair enough. So she decided to forgive some woman of her acquaintance who looked really great in yoga pants. You don't necessarily start with giving over the issues of life and death to the Holy One. That change of motivation, that willingness to commit, doesn't start there. It's something we work on, we practice. Letting go of the motivations of ourselves and moving towards a motivation to be a part of God's work. It takes time. It takes confession so that we can learn how to open our hearts each day. But when you do, you find that your life has meaning, purpose, and joy. Even as you move towards death, I've seen it. You probably have too. My mother was an amazing woman of faith. And for years, she made a point of changing her motivation so that she would feel connected to the presence of God and know that in life and in death, she's cared for and held in the loving arms of God. And as she approached her death, she did so with a sense of peace. She wasn't exactly looking forward to it, but she had a sense that things were going to be solid and okay because she knew that God's promises would stand. My wife's mother was the same way. As she was dying, she said, "Really, don't cry. I'm going on the biggest adventure of my life." That kind of faith comes from a habit, a practice of letting go of the motivations that hang on to our own satisfaction, security, and pleasure, and focusing on God's purpose and God's creative project. Comes from that habit. And when you do, you will find joy exploding in your life. You all are doing really very well. I haven't known you that long, but I see wonderful things. I see people caring for one another. I mean, we start the phone call in the morning and immediately, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" You're doing a good job. And so the call of this passage right now is to continue the work you've been doing, to continue shifting your motivations into the openness of God's enormous creative project. Because then peace will come in the midst of anxiety. You will know God's will, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. And your life will count in this world.